All right, well, it is 7 o'clock, and we're going to get started here tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to Plant Right's 2012 Invasive Plant webinar. My name is Greg Richardson. We're joined here tonight by Doug Johnson, and we have a couple of really great presentations lined up for you all. But before we get into those, what I'd like to do is begin by telling you more about the webinar tool that we're using tonight. The webinar tool we're using is called Omnovia, and I'd like to point out a couple of the key features, some of which you've already picked up on, that might be useful during tonight's event. The first, in the top right-hand side of the screen, there's a green button with a question mark in it. This is a technical support button, so if you have any questions about audio or visuals, you can click on this and you can have, there's a team that can help you. The first link will provide you with answers about how to get those working again. On the bottom left-hand side of the screen is a chat box. We have muted all individuals, and so any two-way communication will be taking place through this chat box. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in there. And then lastly, we will be loading some documents to this webinar, and I will be adding them to the webinar during the intermission, and you can access them during that time at the documents, or using the documents button on the bottom right side of the screen. And so the way that we've broken up this webinar is as follows. Doug Johnson, who we're really lucky to have here tonight, will be providing an update on invasive plant science, policy, and programs. When he's done, I'll be discussing how PlantRight fits into this bigger picture, and then narrowing the conversation to talk about the invasive plants that are still being used for gardening in California. We'll take a 5-minute intermission. You can get up, stretch your legs, whatever you choose to do. And when we come back, I'll be discussing more about the Spring Nursery Survey and what participation in it entails. And then at the very end, we've set aside some time for question and answers. So if you have any questions during any point of the webinar, what we recommend that you do is you type them into that chat box on the left-hand side of the screen, and we will collect them and get to them at the end of the presentations. And a couple of things to note, this webinar is being recorded, so if you would like to go back and review anything in it, you're welcome to do so. We'll be sending you a link to it by email. If you're joining us through the webinar recording, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And the webinar is eligible for continuing education credit if you are a master gardener. Lastly, there is a 5-question quiz that we're going to ask you to complete if you'd like to participate in our Spring Nursery Survey. It's on the content of this webinar and is merely here to inform you I'm sorry. It is merely a matter of ensuring that you've watched this webinar and is not meant to be a barrier to your participation, just something to make sure that you are familiar with what we've covered. So with our housekeeping items out of the way, I'm really pleased to introduce you all to Doug Johnson. Doug is the Executive Director of the nonprofit California Invasive Plant Council. You may know them as Cal-IPC or Cal-IPC. Doug holds a master's degree in geography from San Francisco State University, and prior to coming to the California Invasive Plant Council in 2002, Doug worked in natural resource management for California State Parks. Doug currently serves on the California Invasive Species Advisory Committee, the National Association of Exotic Pest Plant Councils, the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species, and the Steering Committee for the California Horticultural Invasives Prevention Partnership, CalHIP, which happens to be the steering committee for the PlantRight program. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Doug, and I'm going to load his slides up here, so give it just a second. All right, Doug, it's all you.
Great, thanks, Greg. I'm privileged and happy to be here tonight to talk about this with master gardeners and cooperative extension being what it is in the state, providing such a useful role in terms of outreach and getting science out there. It's great to have the opportunity to connect with you all, and definitely the plant survey is a great service to monitoring what's going on in nurseries throughout the state in terms of invasive species that are still on the shelves. Greg, remind me, do I drive the slides forward?
Yeah, if you'd like to, you can just click on the screen and that should do it.
Yep, got it. Thanks. So briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the California Invasive Plant Council, or Cal-IPC for short, we're a 20-year-old nonprofit organization. We're one of about 30 states that have such an organization. We're the largest in terms of staffing and programs, but we have a lot of relationships with sister organizations across the country. We have a staff of 8 currently, board of directors of 15, comprising agency folks and land trust, natural resource managers, et cetera. And we have around 800 members statewide who are chiefly natural resource managers or watershed volunteers or academics working on the ecology of invasive plants. We have an annual conference, we have a newsletter, and we have several program efforts, which I'll mention later in the slideshow. One of the main things that we do is we list invasive plants. So the very basic information about what is an invasive plant in California. And that's part of what I want to talk about tonight. I want to give an update, as the title says, on the policy and programs, some of the happenings there. But at the same time, invasive species and invasive plants are a relatively new concept and a new issue, and it's evolving continually. It's a very dynamic field. So I want to update you on some of the discussions that are happening, because I think that really relates to outreach, which I think is a key part of this issue and one that you all have a role in. So the Cal-IPC inventory lists 200 species that have been evaluated in California based on how much they spread, how much impact they're thought to have on ecology, and ranked in this inventory. And this is necessary because California is a state where no agency has really taken the lead on the ecological impacts of invasive plants. They are still, for the most part, treated as agricultural pests. This inventory has been adopted by the Plant Right Partnership, and this is an example of risk assessment, which is one of the important areas that Cal-IPC works in. Greg, I think this is where you can kick in with some polls. Greg and I set up a few simple questions just to kind of get a sense for where folks are starting from in terms of basic knowledge of invasive plants. So Greg, do you want to walk folks through these, or shall I?
If you want to take it away, unless you prefer I do.
Okay, yeah, I'll run through these. In your Master Gardener outreach, does the concept of invasiveness come up as part of your conversation? Never, rarely, sometimes, or frequently? And as you can just click one of those boxes, and as you can see, it updates as people choose. So I'll give another few seconds here, but it looks like so far nobody has checked never. So it's a concept that does come up, and kind of rarely for a lot of folks, sometimes for a lot of folks, and frequently for some folks. So that's interesting. It is a concept that's out there. Next question, Greg. Now, when the topic does come up, how comfortable do you feel in providing a definition? Like, what is an invasive species? Do you feel comfortable in providing information on that to somebody who's looking to you for information? And anywhere from not a clue up to, yep, I can do it. Great, and someone's even volunteered to give a definition tonight. How do we do that, Greg, before the end? Is that
if they want to type it in the chat box, they're willing to, yeah. Or if they're willing to, they're more than welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, whoever answered in the blue number 4 there wants to type something into the chat box. We can see what your definition is and work from there. I'd be very curious. Let's see. I'm not sure if I'm looking in the right place, but the last thing I see was other people like me wondering if you can tell what we're wearing at the other end of the webinar here. Okay, I'll give it another few seconds and then go on. Okay, well, Greg, if you can do me a favor and just keep an eye on that chat box, and if you do see something pop up, just interrupt me. And okay, cool. I might steal your thunder with my next slide, but the two basic concepts for what is an invasive species is that it's non-native, and I've underlined the term, we need to define that, and it causes harm. So it's something that's not from here originally, it's brought by people, wouldn't have gotten here on its own, and it's causing some sort of harm defined by somebody. And these are the concepts that are used in numerous settings, including legal settings, like in the United States, the definition set out federally. Risk assessment is trying to get at that definition and say, okay, well, how do we tease out in a given situation which species is most important to pay attention to? So, for instance, the Cal-IPC inventory of 200 plant species in California has 13 criteria broken up into these three areas: ecological impact, invasive potential, meaning how fast can it spread, what kind of biological characteristics does it have that allows it to spread, and then how widespread is it in the state, and how widespread could it be in the state? How many areas and habitats could it impact? I'm just seeing something typed into the text box here from Shelley. Thank you, Shelley. A plant that has shown ability to escape cultivation into the wild with support of irrigation or horticultural practices, broadly defined as non-native. That's exactly it. And it's no irrigation support, right? Yes, it can basically spread on its own. You may hear the term naturalized. Naturalized means a non-native species that occurs in the wild on its own, doesn't need water, whatever. It's happy on its own, but it's not invasive until it's actually having an ecological impact and probably spreading. So there's a lot of things that just tend to grow out there, but they're not really a problem. So overall, I think the rules of 10 are basically that for every species that's out there, non-native species out there growing in the wild, 1 out of 10 is actually invasive, and then 1 out of 10 of those may be actually at high level invasive, having a significant impact. Moving forward, so I mean there are a lot of questions about this. Well, what does non-native mean? I mean, how far away does a species have to be moved from? And what about climate change? What if the range for a particular species is shifting as the climate changes? Who determines what's harmful, and what kind of harm are we talking about? Agricultural harm, ecological harm, recreational harm? Do you have to be able to put dollars to it? And then management, what are the goals, and are they realistic? Are we trying to get rid of all non-native plants for some reason because we think it's return to some prior state, or are we just looking to maximize particular ecosystem values, whether it's pollination or clean water or protecting threatened and endangered species? So just to give you a sense for some of the provocative ideas that are out there today, Mark Davis is an academic who's become fairly well known for really challenging some of the concepts of invasive species. And in his first quote here, he's basically saying that the concept of what's native and non-native is really going to stop meaning much. The more we continue with international trade and moving species around, at some point you want to look at harm, and it doesn't really matter whether something's native or non-native. And more succinctly, in the bottom quote from a fairly widely talked about editorial in Nature, talking about whether there's any value to talking about native versus non-native anymore. So I think these are really useful ideas and good to know about and good to test our thinking. I'll talk more tonight about yes, but we know plenty to know that there are really good reasons to worry about non-native species. But and some of the lines are blurred, though. Non-native plants can be used for erosion control or bioremediation. There's more and more talk about what are our ecosystem goals, what are we really looking to conserve, and given that you can't really do everything we want to do, what makes sense? Invasive plants being used for biofuels definitely call to mind the need for a lot of risk assessment because they have a lot of the same characteristics as invasive plants. The consideration of using native plants for restoration, but the fact that we need so many of them sometimes, giving up the need for genetic purity of saying, well, we're only going to use propagate seeds collected in this watershed or something. So I do want to just step back and do a quick rogues gallery of species that are out there, just to remind everybody of the scale of the problem, and that academic discourse aside, there is no controversy really that we have invasive species. We have species that have been brought here by humans that are spreading extensively and causing significant change to the environment, which in many cases is pretty clearly damaging. So in California, although this landscape picture is from Texas on the Rio Grande, in California we have arundo, which can grow to 20 some odd feet tall in riparian areas. There's significant fire danger and crowds out all sorts of other riparian vegetation. The so-called state weed, yellow star thistle, and over something like 10% of the state at this point, and other grassland weeds like the knapweeds. Forest pests like brooms, Scotch, French, Spanish broom, which are nitrogen fixers and change soil chemistry. This is along a utility corridor. Ground covers like vinca, Cape ivy, English ivy. Aquatic and riparian plants. The top picture that looks like a meadow is actually a slough in the delta covered with water hyacinth. Submerged plants like aguria, estuarine plants like spartina in the bay, shown here being sprayed from a helicopter. Some of these are actual ecosystem engineers that change hydrologic processes and obviously are going to impact other aquatic life. Forest pests are a growing issue, coming in often on wood pallets internationally as accidental imports. You may have heard of emerald ash borer in the Midwest, killing trees there. You may have heard of the Asian longhorned beetle in the Northeast. This is a before and after picture from Worcester, Massachusetts, where they took down thousands of trees as the only way that they knew of to stop the spread of Asian longhorn beetle that was feared to could have gone into New England forests really broadly. And here in California, the gold-spotted oak borer down in San Diego County, which is thought to have been brought in on firewood from Mexico or Arizona, and that's another one of those questions. Well, how far away does this thing have to be? But it's actually having a pretty significant impact on oaks down there, and there's fear that combined with sudden oak death, it could have a really bad one-two impact on California's oaks, and this has caused California to jump on board with other states in a campaign to keep people from moving firewood. Fish, you may have heard of the Asian carp in the Mississippi River system, pretty dramatic fish that jump and can cause serious injury, and they're huge, so they really change the ecosystem, and right now the big issue is trying to keep them out of the Great Lakes. Aquatic invertebrates like the quagga and zebra mussels, which have come in through the Great Lakes from Ukraine, and there's a lot of effort to keep them on the east side of the 100th meridian, but they have made it to California, and in Lake Havasu, where this photo is taken, that's a sandal that was underwater, and you can see how thickly encrusted the little mussels are on it. And so that's a huge problem ecologically as well as for water conveyance, for utilities, municipal and agricultural water supply. Mammals like the nutria, especially down in the Mississippi River drainage, and here in California we have feral pigs. Diseases like the chytrid fungus that is really decimating amphibians. Everybody's favorite, the constrictor snakes in the Everglades. It's a really interesting case study of the conflict between whether it's horticultural plants or exotic pets, etc., the desire to have the freedom to have organisms that you're interested in, and how that potentially conflicts with environmental preservation. So switching quickly to some of the policies in play, the state of California in the last 2 years has formed a council of state agencies and a stakeholder committee to advise those state agencies. And one of the accomplishments is this strategic framework with 46 recommended actions. It's online at the URL there. And if you want a quick overview of the kind of things that can be done to prevent the introduction and the spread of invasive species, this is a great place to start. That advisory committee also has come up with a more or less comprehensive list. There's no such thing as a comprehensive list of invasive species, but this is the closest thing yet. This is multi-taxa, so it's got plants, it's got the snakes and birds and everything on it. So it's combining all the taxa, and it's using a uniform assessment for kind of saying how bad they are, how likely to spread they are in California. And this is on a UC Davis website. It's a living list so that experts can log on here and leave comments and update things. So just to give you an idea of some of the things going on in California policy-wise, statewide there's a legislatively mandated review of the Department of Fish and Game called the Fish and Wildlife Vision Process, and they're looking at everything from renaming the department to really trying to support the department in its mandate and having enough budget to do what it does. And from the invasive species end, groups like Cal-IPC are really interested in seeing the Department of Fish and Game take on invasive species a little more than they are now, because it's an important part of preserving the state's wildlife. A simple bill to authorize to the Department of Boating and Waterways to control a new aquatic invasive plant in the Delta points out the need to have a process where we aren't doing it species by species, but we have a more comprehensive approach. And then lastly, I put on here the State Department of Food and Agriculture's budget cuts. That has been where invasive plant work has happened through, and the funding there has been completely cut because they're focusing on agriculture, and the weeds don't make it onto the priority screen when the budget gets really tight. And so that's why things like this Fish and Wildlife Vision Process are incredibly important, because they open up the potential for considering new structures for getting some of this work done. At the national level, the Fish and Wildlife Service and a whole bunch of other partners have drafted a national plan for fish, wildlife, and plant climate adaptation, which is another great place for invasive species to be addressed, because invasives are one of the stressors that can be addressed now that will help the resilience of ecosystems as climate changes. The USDA has the authority to govern imports of plants, and one of the recent accomplishments from stakeholders and USDA is in creating a new category that allows USDA to list species that aren't really here yet, and it could be risky, on this not authorized pending pest risk assessment, or NAPRA list, which basically closes the loophole of anybody being able to bring in anything unless it's a proven plant that's already escaped here and been a real big problem. So it definitely helps prevention. And then the U.S. Forest Service has recently released in the Federal Register an explicit policy on invasive species. And so they're really addressing it head on directly and setting a great example for other agencies. So in California, a couple of the programs that Cal-IPC is involved in that I would mention, mapping is a huge need because so much of the problem is spatial, and climate change is a really important thing to address as well, because we need to be really strategic about where we work on invasive plants. So it's pretty hard to see the details on this, but this is a screenshot from a new tool that Cal-IPC has developed called Cal Weed Mapper, and it maps those 200 invasive plant species that are listed in the inventory. It maps them statewide. And in the green, the red is where the species exists. The black dots show where it's spreading. You can kind of see some white X's on there. Those are areas where that particular plant has been eradicated in the past. The green shows how suitable the habitat is thought to be, and we have a scenario for 2010 currently, and a projected scenario for 2050, so you can see how the suitability changes over time. And in any given particular area, it may get more or less suitable, and that may affect your management strategy. Interestingly, because of smartphones and evolving computer tools, there's a role for citizen science in mapping invasive species. So we work with CalFlora, another nonprofit, which has an online database of native and non-native plant locations in California. And they now have tools with a smartphone observer where you can go out in the field and capture a location and contribute it to an online database, which is super useful. Another thing that's really important is just simple, common sense, best management practices. Whether it's natural resource managers who are out in the wild, who of course are thinking about this already, But the follow-up manual that we're working on is for road and utility corridor maintenance workers. So folks who have a lot of capacity to spread weeds if they're doing something ill-advised, but for whom weeds aren't the primary part of their job. They're there to maintain roadsides or utility corridors. So that's another important effort, is really training people to understand the ecology of how things spread and why it's important to pay attention. Something just I want to put on your radar screen, you may have heard of Tomaso out of UC Davis, with cooperative extension, he's kind of the guru of invasive plant knowledge in California and beyond. These are some of his publications shown here. He is, with other cooperative extension partners, working on a guide to management of invasive plants. These other the Weeds of California and Aquatic Riparian Weeds of the West are basically guides to what are the weeds in these areas, but this new manual will be basically the control techniques, due out sometime in the next year. So getting close to the end, I want to wrap up by talking about the outreach messages that can be given to the public in general. What I'm listing here are the kind of things that the Invasive Species Advisory Committee that I mentioned earlier are looking to advise people on. So what we're talking about tonight, plant right, make smart landscaping choices. There are plants still available through the trade that are causing harm in the landscape, and for multiple reasons, it's not simple to just say, hey, those should be illegal. So it really requires education on the part of the industry as well as the public. Declaring imports at borders. We all know that feeling when you drive into California, you're like, oh, I really don't want to give up those oranges. But it's really important that you do. It's important if you're flying in from abroad, you don't bring things, etc. Or that you don't purchase something that you thought might have been brought here illegally. Cleaning boats and equipment when you're moving around, recreational equipment. It could be as simple as brushing your boots after you go hiking. Keeping pets legal and not releasing them in the wild. And then using local firewood, not moving around wood that could carry forest pests. So those are some of the things that people, everybody can do to help. So finally, I guess the educational take-home that I want to leave folks with tonight is that the concept of invasive species is pretty simple conceptually. It's, a species that has evolved in Asia, really had no way of getting to California except that somebody picked it up and brought it, halfway around the world. And it's one of the few that actually loves the climate here and can grow like wild and have significant impact. I mean, that's a pretty simple concept that people can generally get. But it's also a very complex topic in terms of the ecology itself, in terms of the cultural implications. People saying, well, I'm here from China. Is that a problem? It's a complicated issue. So I think it's important to recognize that as well, and that people can have lots of questions about it, and that shouldn't be dismissed. It is something that people need to explore. And I leave you with this thought at the bottom that I think every time invasive species does come up in conversation and we explore it with somebody, that increases our society's ecological literacy, and that's part of the end goal here is to help us all live sustainably into the future. So I believe that is the last slide, because I'm clicking and nothing's coming up. I thought I might have had a here's how to contact me slide, but apparently not. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Doug. And that was really great. Again, if anybody has any questions for Doug, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we will come back at the end for a period of question and answer to get back to you about those. Now, I'm going to take a second here to talk to you a little bit more about plant right and how it fits into the greater picture that Doug just discussed. And then also talk about some of the invasive plants that we have here in the state that are still being used for gardening and landscaping. And what I'd like to do is take a closer look at some of those plants with you. So this is a plant called Pampas Grass. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was originally brought to California in the late 1800s for the harvesting of its decorative plumes. It's from the Pampas region of South America, so parts of Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina. And it really started to spread after 1950. And I'm showing you this picture not because this is an invasion site. This is actually the growing grounds of a wholesale plant nursery in the Central Valley of California. And while we know that these plants, these specific ones that we're looking at, are being shipped to the Midwest where the deep freezes keep them from becoming an invasive problem out there, I bring this up because some of these plants are still being sold for use in gardening around our state. And so this is a picture that was sent to us by a nursery survey volunteer in 2011. They were visiting a store down in San Diego County. And you could imagine that if you were, a gardener and you didn't know any better, you might take a look at this. And if you wanted, let's say, a big clumping ornamental plant or something to just kind of fill some space in your yard, it's fairly reasonable to assume that you might buy it. And if you did that and brought it home, let's just say, it takes off. It does really, really well, like shown in this picture here. And if you think about it, this homeowner, they might like this plant because it provides them with the privacy that they're looking for. They might like these really big, showy plumes that the plant has. But they probably are not thinking about the fact that each of these plumes contains up to 10,000 seeds. And each of these seeds can travel up to 2 miles in the wind. And so pretty soon you're not talking about how this plant behaves just in their yard. You're talking about how it grows in the entire neighborhood and in the entire, watershed, the wildlands around the neighborhood, the microclimate, etc. And so what can happen are situations like this one. This is a bluff in Pacifica, California, between San Francisco and Santa Cruz counties. And this picture was taken along Highway 1, and you can see that there's really only one type of plant that's growing there. And these plants don't provide particularly good forage for the wildlife in that area, and they're also highly flammable. So they aren't a plant you particularly want to have around. And so this is an image that was taken from Cal-Weed Mapper, the tool that Doug was just talking about. And it shows where Pampas grass is currently found in our state. And you can see that there are populations of it clustered around the Bay Area, the northern part of the Central Valley, sort of along the coast in Southern California. But really, it's found scattered in and around just about every single county of our state. And so another thing that can happen are situations like this one. This is B.J. Burns. He's a fourth-generation farmer in San Mateo County, and his property is just east of where that picture along the bluffs in Pacifica was taken just 2 slides ago. And he was quoted in this magazine, in the California Country magazine, as saying this: "I'm several miles inland from where it was first planted, and we're seeing it now on the hillsides and along the creeks. There are places around here so choked with pampas grass you can't use the land to grow anything anymore." And so this isn't just a big environmental issue. It's also a really big economic one. Every year, California spends $82 million controlling, monitoring, mapping, and doing outreach around invasive plants. And this number is actually a low estimate. It doesn't take into account the fact that if you were to ask a lot of these organizations who are spending this money, whether it's organizations, land managers, government agencies, a lot of them would probably tell you that they could use additional resources to adequately address this issue. And in addition, it doesn't take into account the fact that invasive plants can increase fire hazard, as shown by the picture on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, which is the 2003 San Diego fire descending into the neighborhood of Poway. And this fire was largely fueled and transported by invasive plants in that region. In addition, invasive plants can degrade recreational activities. They can dry up streams in the summer. They can uproot and impact our infrastructure. And like the situation with B.J. Burns, they can also impact agricultural yields. And so now I'm going to ask a poll of my own. I would like to know, what percentage of the invasive plants in our state do you think were introduced to California as ornamentals? So when you have a second, if you could just kind of punch in your best guess. I don't need to think too hard about it, but just kind of like to get an idea of your general impression. All right. So similar to Doug's poll, nobody said 10%. A couple of people said 25%. About half said 50%, and then the majority said 80%. Well, it turns out that a group of researchers in 2003 asked this very question. And what they found was that of all of the invasive plants that we have here in the state, about half of them, or 48%, were originally introduced as ornamental plants through the horticultural trade. And it's easy enough to look at this and want to point fingers and say, oh, well, the nursery trade is the one that is causing this problem, and they should be the ones that are doing something about this. But I think it's important to note that a lot of these plants, like this Pampas grass that I showed you earlier, were introduced here over 100 years ago. And the people that brought them here likely, I think it's fair to say, did not know that they were going to become an invasive problem later on. And so what we are doing is we're looking at this and recognizing that if we want to address the introduction of invasive plants into our state and prevent them from becoming a problem going forward, that working with the nursery industry on this issue is one of the better opportunities to really make an impact in this area. And so this is really why the Plant Right Project was started, was to prevent future introductions and the sale of invasive plants to California through the nursery trade. And so one of the first questions when Plant Right was started that we had to ask ourselves was, what garden plants are invasive in California? And what we quickly realized is that a plant invading the desert area of our state is not likely to be a problem in the rainy forests of the North Coast or up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so what we did is we divided the state into 5 key regions, as shown here on the slide, based on the sunset zones that are found in the Western Garden Book. And so what we've done is we've created this plant list with 19 invasive plants that we are kind of using as a starting point, and then alternative plants that you could use in their place. And so this is one of the materials that I'm going to add to the document section during the intermission. And I'll remind you about that if you'd like to take a look through it later. One of the great things about it is that if you flip it over, the second page has pictures of these plants to help you recognize them. And so the approach that Plant Right has taken is sort of a multifaceted approach. One of the things that we recognized was that the issue of invasive plants is a really big one. And as opposed to going out into the field and trying to remove all of the invasive plants that are already out there, and there are a lot of great groups that are currently doing this, we recognize that our efforts would be best served by focusing on a particular aspect of this bigger picture. And so we're working to prevent the supply of these plants from coming in through the nursery trade. And so one of the things that we're doing is we've established partnerships with different nurseries. A lot of them that we are working with are on the wholesale side of the supply chain. And what we're doing is we're meeting with the owners of these companies to talk about what it might take to remove these 19 plants on our list from their inventories and from trade. In addition, we are looking at the possibility of trying to work with them to prevent new plants, whether from overseas or modifications of existing cultivars, from being developed and introduced to California that could have very high risk of becoming an invasive later on. And so this is the second thing that we're doing, is we're working to prevent new invasions. One of the things that we've come to learn in talking with these nurseries is that they don't want to be introducing invasive plants. They're not out there trying to muddle up our ecosystems. But one of the things that is difficult for them is that they do not have the capacity to adequately, accurately, and scientifically screen new plants before they're introduced. And so we've worked with the UC Cooperative Extension and UC Davis to develop a weed risk assessment tool that you can take a plant and ask a series of questions about it, and in answering those, come out with a score that predicts the possibility that it could become an invasive risk going forward. The other thing that we're doing is we are maintaining partnerships with the California Invasive Plant Council and early detection networks to monitor new invasions as they start to get out there. So we understand that there could be invasive plants that slip through the cracks, and as new plants start to become invasive, we hope to take this information and feed it back to the nursery industry to get these plants off the store shelves before they really get out there and become a big problem like Pampas grass and brooms and some of the other ones that we're concerned with. And the last thing that we're doing is something that I think you all are interested in, because for many of you, it's why you're here tonight. We conduct our spring nursery survey every spring. We started in 2010, and we work with volunteers around the state to collect data about the invasive plants from our list that are still being sold at retail stores. And this is really great because it provides us with information about which of these plants are still out there, who's selling them, where they're being sold, and so we can track this market for invasive plants over time. And in addition, it helps to inform our strategy as we engage the nursery industry on this issue. And so we've partnered mostly with the master gardener community throughout California, and their participation has been terrific, really kind of a perfect group to be working with. And where there have been gaps in our coverage, we've also reached out to other conservation and plant enthusiast groups like the Resource Conservation Districts, California Native Plant Society, and others. And I'd like to pause here for a second to thank you all for joining us tonight, and everybody who's joined us in the past. We really can't conduct the survey without your participation. And so one of the things that we do as a thank you is we take all of the results that have been collected, and we synthesize them into a 2-page fact sheet like the one you see here before you on the screen. And so in 2011, here's what we found. This is another one of the documents that I'll be adding during the intermission, if you'd like to take a closer look at it. And there were 226 stores that we surveyed throughout 38 counties in the state. So it was a pretty comprehensive survey. And one of the things that I'd like to do, just to kind of take some, to save us some time, is I'd like to look a little bit more closely at the graph that's now highlighted in yellow on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And to preface, I'd like to inform you that there was a survey that was conducted in 2003 by the California Invasive Plant Council in partnership with the master gardener community in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. And here's what they found. A handful of the stores were selling a majority of the stores were selling a handful of the invasive plants on our list. Most of the invasive plants were being sold to some capacity, and all of the stores were carrying at least one of the invasive plants on our list, typically more. Now, the results from the survey cannot be directly compared to what we found in 2011 because the geographic scope is different. That one was focused on 2 counties versus the whole state. Some of the methodology was a little bit different. But for basic basis of comparison, just to kind of understand general trends, here's what we found in 2011. And if there's anything, if you can gather anything from it, I think that it's safe to say that there has been at least a general decline in the availability of these plants. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in a little bit more closely at the same data. So now it says 16% on the left-hand axis as opposed to 100%. And so looking at this data a little bit more closely, you can see that periwinkle was the most widely sold plant on our list. This is Vinca major, not Vinca minor, followed by Pampas grass at about 9% of stores and green fountain grass at 8%. And then it falls off pretty quickly from there. And so we're using the results from the nursery survey and learning where to focus our work in order to make the biggest difference. We've taken these 3 plants and then clumped the brooms together on the slide because they're significant as a whole, and are using this as examples of where we can really start to make the biggest impact within the industry and in defense of our environment. And it's forcing us to evaluate whether we approach nurseries going forward with a handful of plants versus the full list, because it's possible that shortening the list to the most widely found handful of plants will allow us to have a more meaningful conversation than trying to make a convincing argument about 19 plants simultaneously. Also, as some of these plants are found less and less, there's the question of how we amend this list and update it going forward. And all of this using the results of the nursery survey to guide our work. So I'm going to talk about the nursery survey more after the intermission, but I'd like to pause here and take 5 minutes to allow you to get up, stretch your legs, use the restroom, whatever you choose to do. I'm going to put the 5 minutes up as a timer on the screen. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and we will get to them at the very end of the presentation tonight. Thank you very much. All right, we have about 10 seconds left, so if you could get back and settle into your seats, we're going to get started here in just a second. All right, well, thank you everybody who has been asking questions, and feel free to keep that up. We look forward to answering them at the end. What I'm going to do now is go into more detail about our spring nursery survey and what participation in that entails. The first thing that I'd like to do is discuss a little bit more about the survey design. One of the things that we have done is we've split the survey up this year. So in Southern California, it takes place from March to May because spring comes earlier down there than it does in Northern California. And then in Northern California, it will take place from mid-April to June. And so what we recommend is, depending on the specific climate where you live, we ask that you go and visit these nurseries when spring is really in full bloom in your area. We found that waiting a little bit longer is actually a little bit better than going too soon. Last year there was some input from nursery survey volunteers that found that stores were carrying more plants later than they were earlier in the year. In addition, we've randomly selected 282 retail nurseries throughout the state. We've randomly selected them for statistical purposes. And we've done so in a way that's proportionate to the number of nurseries that are operating in each county. So there are going to be more stores, let's say around San Jose and Santa Clara County, than there are in Modoc County, Plumas County, Del Norte, some of the smaller, less populated counties of our state. And so there are 7 steps for participating in the survey, and I'm going to go through them all briefly with you here and then in more detail later on. But the first is to create an account on our website, plantright.org. The second is to complete the online quiz that we had mentioned earlier. The third is to select a store to survey, and then the next is to gather survey materials that we'll provide for you. The 5th step is to visit the store and to collect data. 6th is to take that data and submit it to us online and any photos that you might take. And then the last is an optional one to provide us with feedback on your experience. And I'll again tell you more about each of these in just a second. I should note though that each of these steps can actually be completed through our website, except for actually going and visiting the store itself. That you still have to do. So the first step, creating an account. This is a picture of our homepage, and as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's an area under the red text that asks for a username and password. If you've participated in the survey before, your username from last year is still valid. You can log in using that. If you've forgotten your password, you can request a new one there at the bottom left side of the screen, and if you need a new account, you're welcome to create one just by clicking on that link. Now, once you've created an account, you'll see that there's a tab on the left-hand side of the screen that says Spring Survey. And under that, if you click on it, there's a link for the webinar quiz. So this is the quiz on the content of this webinar, and it's just to ensure that you've watched it and are familiar with the material and what it takes to complete the survey. We just want to make sure that everybody is sort of on the same page and understands what's expected. If you take the quiz, 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 questions is considered passing. If you don't pass the quiz the first time, you can take it again until you do. And so once you pass the quiz, you'll be taken to the instructions page, which is shown on the screen here. And this is really a good place to use as your home base for completing the survey, because when you start from the top and work your way down, it walks you through each of the steps of the survey until you're done. And you can find it either by being taken directly to it after you pass the quiz. You can also click on the instructions page on the left-hand side of the screen. Right under that is a link that says Nursery List. And as you can see, number 1 under step 1 is to review the list of nurseries to survey, and that's how you can select the store. So if you click on that text that's highlighted in red, or on the text on the left where the arrow is pointing to, it'll take you to that nursery list. Now, before we go there, I'd like to point out that what we're doing to make it fair for everybody who is joining us both live for the webinar and then also through the recording is that we're going to release this list of stores in Northern California on April 20th at noon. So please mark your calendars if you feel like that would be helpful. That's when all the stores will go up and you'll be able to kind of go through and get your first pick of nursery. Now, this is the nursery list right here. These are the stores from 2011. And I'd like to call out a couple of things. If you would like, you can sort this list by county by clicking on the drop-down menu at the top. And let's say you decide in looking at these stores that you want to survey the Walmart, the second one down in Union City of Alameda County. What you'll do is you'll click on the Survey This Nursery text on the right-hand side of the screen. Another window will come up saying, are you sure that you want to survey this nursery? And you say yes. And what will happen is that store will drop down from this list, and you'll be able to find information about it by clicking on the My Nurseries link on the left-hand side of the screen. In addition, an email will be sent to you with information about that store and confirming that you signed up. Now, what if there are no stores left to survey? What if, they've all been accounted for? So here, I am in San Francisco County. I don't see any stores on the list. Well, what should I do? Well, one of the things that we're asking people to do this year, back when they create an account, is mention or make a point to say whether or not they would be willing to conduct the survey with other participants. And so if there are no more stores to survey in your county, please contact me, and I can look to see if any others in your area have indicated they would be willing to partner on the survey, and I can connect with them. I would keep it anonymous and just see if they would be interested in tag teaming this survey with you. And so one of the things that we found is that teaming up is both more effective, but it's also really a lot more fun. This is a picture of the Master Gardeners in Monterey Bay, or Monterey and Santa Cruz counties. And what they did last year, and the year before actually, is they went to a restaurant for brunch on a Saturday morning. They got together, they had a nice meal, had a lot of fun, and then went out to the store together, divided up the different parts of the store because it was a rather large nursery, and collected information there. And so having somebody to look at the nursery tags while you look at the survey form for the plants that we're interested in really makes it a lot easier in the end. And so there are certain counties where we expect that this is possibly going to be more likely than in others. These I've highlighted in blue, where we have more volunteers that have signed up than stores that we're looking to survey. And in some of these counties, I've worked with your coordinator to add additional stores to this list. Having more information just improves the accuracy of our results. But just sort of as a fair warning, this is something that might come up. Now, one of the things that's also important to us is making sure that we survey all of the stores on our list that were originally selected. And so another thing that you can do is you can look at neighboring counties where there might be a surplus of stores. And so these are just rough estimates of where I expect there will be surpluses. But what we're kind of making the going rule is that if you wait 2 weeks for everyone to participate locally in the county where they live, this will allow them, enough time to sign up for the stores that they'd like to select. And then after those 2 weeks, so this is going to be May 4th, which is a Friday, you can go in and sign up for them yourself. And I'd like to note that for the Master Gardeners out there, we did talk to Pam Geisel about this, and she did okay you're going out and collecting information from neighboring counties. She asked that you still submit your hours to the county, the Master Gardener county that you belong in. And in addition, one of the reasons behind this is that, invasive plants don't really know county borders. If the microclimate or general climate, I guess, that you live in is similar to the county next to yours, then those invasive plants in that county still pose a risk to your county, to the land and the wildlife and the ecosystems around where you live. Now, I'd also like to point out that there are some counties where there are no stores. And so whether, let's say there are no stores in those counties and you live in one, you'd like to participate in the survey, or there are no stores that are left in your county and you'd like to participate and it really just isn't feasible for you to get to a neighboring county. We know that that can be a really long drive depending on where that store is located and where you live. Please contact me and I'd be happy to help you. We want to encourage people's participation in the survey if there's interest. So let me know. I'll be putting my information up, my email and my phone number at the end of this presentation. And so now you've signed up for a store. The next step is to gather the survey materials. We've created these 3 forms that we'd like you to bring with you to the nursery. They are the survey instructions, a survey form, and an explanation sheet. And the explanation sheet is one that we'd like you to print in color because there are pictures of the plants on the back and it really isn't very meaningful in black and white. But if printing is going to be a barrier for you to participating in the survey, please let us know and we would be happy to print these out and mail them to you. So the instructions checklist really is a checklist. It's set up so that you can go through it and mark off all the little boxes until you're done with the survey. We recommend that you print this out and bring it with you to the store because it's a really good resource to have when you might not have our website or other materials available to you to answer any questions that you have. This is our survey form, and if this is new to you, it might look a little bit daunting, but we've broken it up in a way that we hope is most helpful to you. Each of these gray bars that run horizontally divide up the plants based on their growth form. So the ones that are highlighted here are the forbs, herbs, and grasses. If the nursery that you're visiting is not set up by growth form, we've also provided an alphabetical list on the top right-hand side of the screen using the scientific names of these plants. So that might be a place to look as well. Now, near the top left here, there is a section for you to just kind of add in just sort of general information about the store and your name and your email. But I'd also like to call out there's a store code that we're asking you to provide. And we are giving each store a code as opposed to using its name to really do our best to protect the identity of these stores and keep this anonymous amongst the general public. The next thing that we're doing is we are tracking the amount of time that is spent in the stores on the survey. We want to keep track of this and kind of use it in our analysis. And then there are a couple of new things this year, if you joined us last year, that I'd like to point out. The first is that this section used to say cultivar name and/or plants, and/or related plants. And a couple of individuals pointed out that related plants could mean a lot of different things. And so what we've decided to do is instead ask you for plants that are in the same genus. So that arundo plant on the top, arundo donax, if there's another plant that you find that is arundo something else, please include that here. And then any photos that you take, we've added a checkbox here just to kind of give you a little bit of an extra help in remembering to take photos because those are really important to us. And so we recognize that nurseries are going to have different amounts of information available based on the plant tags that they provide. And so what we ask is you really just write down as much information as is available to you. And you know, that's really the best that you can do. And it does still provide a lot of information to us regardless, just knowing that it's there. And so the third material is our explanation sheet. And this has information about plant rate and about the survey and some of our findings from last year. And this is something that we're offering as a replacement of the plant rate brochures that we sent around last year. And the reason that we're doing this is that what we found was that only about half of the people that participated in the survey last year received the brochure, and only about half of those ended up distributing them to the nurseries. And so we thought that it would be a little bit easier to provide you with the actual, like a printable sheet, so that we don't have to coordinate the shipping with all of your coordinators and then distribution through your various meetings. And so the other good thing about this is that the explanation sheet speaks more specifically about what the Plant Rate Project is and about the nursery survey in a way that might be relevant to the store, including having some frequently asked questions on there. And if you flip it over, there are pictures of the plants to help you identify them. So this will be helpful as an identification tool as you go around the nursery and collect information about these plants. And so this brings up the question of interacting with store staff. We do our best to conduct the survey in good faith with the nursery industry. It's not tied to regulatory efforts, and any information from the store remains anonymous, so there's really no risk to the store itself. So we do welcome you to inform the stores that you're there to conduct the survey. You can go right up to the nursery staff and let them know. No disguises are necessary. Now, if you are talking to a store employee about the survey, this is a good opportunity to use that explanation sheet. There are some good talking points on there, and you can even leave it with the store staff if you'd like. One other thing to note is that it has PlantRight's website on it, so you can refer the staff to it if they'd like to learn more about our program or get in touch with us. Now, if you'd prefer not to engage the store and let them know, while you're there, you just want to go collect information and leave, that's okay too. The executive director of the organization that I work for used to work in the nursery industry, and her input was that a lot of these companies will do data collection on their own, and it's a fairly common thing that takes place. And so this survey is not unique. In the event, though, that somebody asks you not to complete the survey while you're at the store, we ask that you respect that request. You just let us know, and we'll work with you on a case-by-case basis. But I should note that there were 226 stores that were surveyed last year. In only 2 cases outside of those 226 were volunteers asked not to collect information at that store. And it was fine, but I point that out because this really only happened at less than 1% of the nurseries that were out there. And then lastly, I'd like to remind you that this survey is really for data collection purposes. So we ask that you please refrain from doing outreach on our behalf while you're visiting the store. And so then there's one more material that I'd like to go over with you, and that's our plant identification guide. And this is going to be recommended for this year solely for the purpose of just not trying to put too many printing needs on you. So this is a really good resource because it has bigger pictures of the plants and insets of those plants to show what they might look like in the nursery. And if you are going to use that explanation sheet to explain the survey to somebody at the store, if that's the only thing that you have with pictures on it, you might want to hold on to it until the end of your data collection process before relinquishing it so that you have those pictures available to you. If you are going to give it to the store staff, then having this plant identification guide becomes especially helpful. And to zoom in a little bit, here are 2 examples of how those plants might look in the wild and how you might find them in the stores. And I show this because they're not necessarily going to be in bloom, they might be dormant, etc. So you have all the materials. Now you go to visit the store and collect data. That's step 5. And so what we recommend is giving yourself about 45 to 90 minutes. It took about 50 minutes on average for volunteers to collect data last year. And it really is going to depend on the size of the store and how well it's organized and how well the plants are labeled. So the first thing that we recommend is getting a lay of the land, see how the store is laid out. And one of the things that you can do is note that none of the plants on our list are edibles, annuals, or indoor plants. And so if there are sections of the nursery dedicated to these types of plants, you can cross that off your list entirely. And so if you find an invasive plant, the first thing to do is to record information about it and take a photo. And because there was some confusion last year, I'd like to go into a little bit more detail about explaining what to look for in identifying the ice plants that are on our list. On the left-hand side of the screen is Carpobrotus edulis. That's highway ice plant, also known as Hottentot fig. It has 3 distinct sides, pointed tips, and the leaf length is about 3 inches. The 3 sides of the leaf is something that really differentiates it from the vast majority of ice plants that are out there. On the right-hand side is crystalline ice plant. And as you can see, the leaves are in clusters and look more like actual leaves that you would see on another, shrub or tree, for instance, than it is like most ice plants that have spiky or cylindrical leaves. And it also has this sort of crystal, dewy-like substance that builds up on the outside of the plant. And so here are some pictures of the ice plants that were submitted to us last year. And as you can see, these are not the invasive plants on our list. It's not, to call anyone out for sending us wrong plants, but I just want to send you out there as well informed as possible. And if you do have any question as to whether or not the plants that we're interested in are indeed the invasives, or I'm sorry, the plants that you find are indeed the invasives, it's best to take precaution, write down the information, take the pictures, and send them to us, and we'll review those pictures and make sure that the plants in question are in fact the invasives we're interested in. And if you do find an invasive plant, we'll ask you to take 2 pictures of it. You can take more if you'd like, but at least one of the plant tag and one of the plant itself. And the verification of these plants, which is what we'll use these pictures for, is really important to us because sometimes plants can be mislabeled, sometimes they just look very similar to one of the invasive plants on our list, but they may not be. And so we use this information to verify that the plants are indeed what has been written down on the plant tag. And in addition, if we don't have these photos, we can't make that verification, and we're not going to be able to use that data. So that is, a really vital piece to this data collection process. And so here are a couple of photos that I want to call out just for the sake of showing you, what not to do in the hope that it is instructive in your experience when you go out to these stores. If you find an invasive plant, the top left picture shows a plant tag where the text is really hard to read. You can zoom way in and just barely make it out. But if you can zoom in a little bit more closely to these plant tags, that would be preferred so that it's just more easily legible. On the top right-hand side, it's hard to tell what the plant of interest is and differentiate it from the plants around it. So in trying to determine whether or not this plant could, is the species that we're interested in, having something where it's easier to see the plant leaves and the stems and the way that they all interact is really ideal. The bottom right photo shows a plant that we're interested in, but it's in the background. It's the yellow plant, the broom, that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So getting unobstructed pictures of these plants, again, is preferred. And then in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you can see that this plant picture is a little bit blurry. Again, we could make this out. It's not too bad, but there are some blurry pictures that we get where it's just really entirely illegible. And so if you have a digital camera, what we recommend is just kind of flipping through the pictures that you took while you were at the nursery to make sure that you captured the plants and their labels in a way that we can really do the most work with them. And then there are a couple of things that we would like to see. If you go with a team or you see anything kind of fun or quirky about the store, any just beautiful displays of plants, feel free to take a couple of extra pictures, just an extra handful, and send them along to us. It's a really nice personal touch. So when you get back from the nursery and you have all the data, step 6 is to submit that to us and any photos that you have online. And this is regardless of whether you find invasive plants at the store or not. We'd like to know either way. And so what you'll go and do is submit a survey on our website. You can type all the information in through the various fields that we've created for you. If this is in any way an issue or you'd prefer to just mail us the forms, you're welcome to do that as well. Just send them to us at our address, and you can email me if you don't have it. And then upload the photos. That's a new thing this year. You can just go ahead and upload them from your computer, and we will have them on our database, and that'd be great. The next thing to do, if you would like, is to provide us with your feedback. This is the last step, step 7. You'll receive an email after you submit your data confirming that we received it and with a link to the survey form. So feel free to fill out this questionnaire if you have any information about your experience that might help us to make it better for everybody next year. Lastly, there's a reminder that if you're a Master Gardener, you can log your hours online to the Master Gardener Volunteer Management System, and there's a reminder in the instructions to do so. And then we have a frequently asked questions page on our website that you can use if you have any questions. Of course, you're also welcome to just email me or call me, and I'd be happy to answer them myself. So thank you all very much for sitting through this webinar and joining us tonight. We are now finished, so what I'm going to do is put our information up on the screen, and I'm going to invite Doug back to answer some questions, and I'll probably, it looks like based on the questions we got tonight, we might be both chiming in. So Doug, if you want to come back and join us.
Sure, yeah, thanks. And I believe, yeah, there, excuse me, I believe there were questions both about the survey and about invasive plants found in nurseries. one I just saw recently was, I think answered in your talk, but do the nurseries know that you're coming? And it sounded like from what you said, it's up to the survey volunteers how they approach or don't approach the staff at the nursery. But as I understand it, there's no advance notice given to the nursery. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. We had discussed and really thought deeply about giving all of these nurseries fair notice by calling ahead and letting them know that we'd conduct this survey. In the off chance that this might in any way skew the results that we get, we decided not to do that. And instead, you know, we're making a conscious effort to really protect the identity of these stores, letting them know that this is not a regulatory effort, that their information about their store and about the company, if it's a chain store, will, you know, not be publicly distributed. Generally tends to ease any concerns that they have. They're also welcome to call us, but they will not know in advance that you're coming, but you're welcome to tell them once you get there. And then I noticed.
Great.
Were there any questions that you wanted to cover? I know that there were a couple, I think.
Yeah, there were a bunch actually. One of the first ones that came up, I think, is one of the top issues that we've wrestled with over time in the Plant-Right partnership, which is how do you say for sure that a particular cultivar is a problem or not? So with something like Pampas Grass, where there are numerous cultivars and many of them are purported to be sterile, how do you sort that out? And it's a really difficult issue. There has been some research at UC Davis. Several projects have looked at the genetic markers using molecular techniques, looking at genetic markers of populations in the wild and various horticultural cultivars. And for instance, on Pampas Grass, the results basically said that in the Pampas Grass populations growing wild in California, they found evidence of genetics from all of the general types. There were seven different genetic pools basically identified for horticultural Pampas Grass, and all of them, to varying degrees, were found in the wild Pampas Grass, some much more than others. And it doesn't point the smoking gun at any one cultivar because it was only looking at pools of, you know, there may be 5 cultivars that all belong to a same genetic pool. But basically it suggested that you can't say that any particular cultivar is safe. Sometimes what's meant by sterile is, you know, it's one gender of a dioecious plant, like in the case of Pampas Grass. So it's, and you know, there are issues of sterile cultivars reverting over time, you know, through several generations to a more reproductively viable plant. So that issue has come up around Pampas Grass. It's come up around English ivy in Washington State. The ivy growing in the wild was studied and was determined that it was closest to not the Hedera helix, the English ivy that everyone thought it was, but to Hedera hibernica and hibernate, I can't remember the common name, but another ivy species that was not as common in the trade, but seemed to be the one that was escaping mostly into the wild. And then the third main species where it's come up has been broom, which was brought up in a comment. And mostly what one will see in nurseries nowadays, it goes by a couple different scientific names, but it's generally called sweet broom as a common name. And that has not been shown to be invasive. But again, the genetic evidence suggests that it can contribute to invasive populations. The pollen can contribute to wild populations. So, you know, from an invasive plant perspective, it would be simplest to just say don't use any of them. From trying to work with the industry, we are trying to be as conservative as possible and say that only plants that are known to have current ecological impacts should not be sold. So that's on our Cal-IPC brochures, that shows up as a caution. The evidence isn't in to say for sure that it's causing problems, but the cautious approach would be not to use it. So that's a long-winded answer, but it is something that the Plant Right Partnership is looking at.
Great.
So does that mean, for example, that if we see sweet broom, should we count it on the survey? And Greg, you probably need to answer, but no, I believe on the survey we're looking at specific species like Scotch broom and French broom. Is that correct?
So that is correct. This does feed into that part of the survey form where we ask for any plants in the same genus that you might find in the stores, and oftentimes sweet broom is listed as Genista racemosa, and that shares the genus name with one of the invasive plants from our list that we're interested in. So if you do see it, and because it is kind of one of these hot plants that we're still trying to figure out what to do with because the information about its invasiveness isn't really out yet, please do write it down, and we'll just take a note of it. We're not going to include it in the analysis as an invasive plant found in a nursery, but it's good to just have that information as we continue to look at this plant going forward.
Yeah, that's a perfect approach. I think it'd be great to note it. Same with, I'm not sure on Cordaria. Are we just looking at Cordaria celoana, just no cultivar or all cultivars, or how is that treated on the survey, Greg?
With that one, we're actually looking at all cultivars, largely because of what you had mentioned with the study that was done on the invasive properties of even sterile Pampas grass plants and their contributions to natural areas, or the populations of invasive Pampas grass plants in natural areas. So with that one, please, just write down all the information about it, including the cultivar name. But in that case, we are going to include it as an invasive in our survey, regardless.
Perfect. There was another question about working not just with retailers, but what about wholesalers and I think by implication growers, et cetera. And that is a big part of what Plant Right is involved in, is working with the growers to understand which of the current plants that are out there are invasive, that we're, these 19 that we're working to get off the shelves. And also, as Greg mentioned, the risk assessment so that new introductions that are being researched in the future and developed to make sure that they have information to assess up front whether those might be a problem. And big box stores have a key role in driving a lot of what growers grow. So sustainable conservation staff working on Plant Right are active in negotiating with those folks to sign on to not selling these plants as well.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that we're also doing is in this survey, we're asking you to include any information that might be on the plant tag about the name of the grower or the wholesale nursery who supplied this plant to the nursery that you're surveying, the retail nursery, because oftentimes that information is available. It isn't always, but when it is, it's nice to keep track of that because then you can kind of get a general picture for the supply chain and where this plant started and then ultimately where it wound up. And then as a last note to that, there are wholesale nurseries that do provide their plant catalogs online. And so you can go to their websites and just kind of flip through what's available and sometimes get a feel for who's selling what, especially with the larger suppliers in that fashion. So that's something that we've looked at in the past, but we don't necessarily need a team of people going around and visiting the actual nursery locations. We can just kind of take care of that in-house, and that's how we've approached that.
Right. So there are a number of angles that are being approached: the retail angle and the supply side, and then the last one that's maybe the hardest to get a handle on is internet supply. So that's a big part of where public education comes in, so that even if it's available on the internet, people think twice before using it. Mm-hmm. It connects to another one of the questions, which was, hey, what about displays for retail nurseries that help them explain to customers why they don't sell certain plants? And I think that's also been, that kind of outreach has been discussed for a long time, and I don't think the team has really resolved the ideal way to get nurseries to sign on to a pledge and then to give them materials to communicate that to their customers. But I like the idea of a simple display. I think the brochures to date have been meant in part to fill that need. but I think a display might do it better. But certainly if folks have ideas about what sorts of materials they think might work best in the nurseries that that you're familiar with, getting those to Greg would be great.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really great idea, and even just having something available through our website or a form that they could fill out and we could send them some kind of a display like that would be really great, and just helping them to get the recognition for doing the right thing, and also communicating to their customers why certain plants like the Vinca major or the Pampas grass might not be available in their store anymore.
And finally, somebody asked about, hey, can I take out broom when I'm walking down the road? And I certainly, it's a great idea. Broom is one of those tricky ones, though, in that if you cut it, it often resprouts. If you pull it out of the ground disturbance often allows seeds to resprout as well. So it requires a lot of persistent attention. But yeah, it makes itself very obvious with its yellow flowers. So it's a good one to grab when you see a new one getting started.
Great. And
the only other ecological issues there, beyond just the biological issues with whacking it, I mean, you need to know what kind of land it's on too, and whether, if it's on your on somebody's private property, you may not want to grab it, or even if it's on, in the park you frequent, you may want to have a sense for whether you need to ask first or not. But yeah, that's what weed workers do.
Great. And the last question that I saw was, does the survey allow us to note if we find the plants growing at the nursery display garden but not actually for sale? So if the plant is somewhere within the nursery but not actually being sold to its customers. If you'd like to note that, one of the things we also have provided on the survey form is a comment section. And so, noting anything along these lines, like if there's a plant that's growing at the display garden, that's great. One of the really interesting pictures that we found last year from the survey that someone submitted to us was a nursery with a whole clump of Pampas grass plants growing just along the border of the property. And so it indicated to us that this plant used to be for sale there, and now it is growing invasive right on the other end of the fence, and they aren't selling it, but they can't really get rid of it, right? And so if there are any occasions like that, having that as just sort of a good story is good for us to know. And I think,
Greg, there are a couple other questions on there for you, I think.
Okay. Let me take a look. Do you see any in particular? Oh, here we go. They just came up. So Debbie writes, okay, that was the sweet broom question. We already covered that. Ken wrote, for those of us that are pest control advisors, do you provide DPR CEUs for this webinar? Just thought I'd ask just in case. So we have not coordinated this with the DPR, and we haven't established this as eligible for continued education units, but maybe that's something that we could talk about if there's somebody that you'd like us to put you in touch with. And we might be able to make that possible, but it hasn't been set up yet at this point. And then
I'll just mention on that, I'm not sure if Ken's familiar with Cal-IPC much, but we do offer field courses on various topics that do offer DPR credits.
Great. And Doug, it looks like you answered Shelley's question there. I don't know if you want to make any extra points. You answered in the chat box. If there's anything else you want to add to
that. I haven't been hearing this kind of thing quite as much in recent years about municipalities actually using something in their own landscaping. And I thought pretty much in the Bay Area that municipalities were pretty on board with bay-friendly landscaping. And often handing out brochures, don't plant a pest brochures, et cetera, at their planning counters, so that people doing landscaping for home or commercial or new developments also saw that information. But I think there are a lot of organizations that could help working with the city of Walnut Creek, including the local Native Plant Society chapter, the county agricultural commissioner who oversees the weed management area, et cetera, would probably discourage them seriously from using broom and landscaping. So thanks for noticing it. And if you're out walking and you're seeing it purposefully planted, that might be the kind of case where you don't want to just pull it out, but you need to work within the system to discourage its use. Greg, I thought there was one more question for you about each volunteer selecting only one store to survey.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I missed that one. So what we would recommend you're doing is, especially in the counties where we expect that we're going to have excess help, just sign up for one store just to allow everybody the opportunity to participate. One of the things that you could do is sign up for one store, and then once you collect the data there, sign up for another store. Now, if there are stores that are located so closely together that it just makes sense for you to visit them all at once, then feel free to sign up for both. That's really not a problem. We haven't really come up with an official rule on this, but just kind of out of respect for everybody who wants to participate in the survey, I would say start with one and then go from there. And so we are at 8:30, so I think that we will call it a night. Denise, I'll email you a response to your question, but for the sake of kind of staying on schedule here, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I thought this was a really great webinar, and I look forward to working with many of you this spring as we collect information at retail stores around the state. And thank you, Doug, for joining us.
Thank you, Greg. My pleasure.
All right. Good night, everybody.